But there was no real financial plan here to establish a currency in New Zealand by governors, and we know, for example, that the Union Bank of Australia arrived here in 1840, which didn't have the ability to issue script, and then the colonial bank started up, which started issuing script, but that was very limited and unsuccessful. And so by 1860 there were really only two banks here, the Union Bank of Australia and also the Oriental Bank, which Falconer Larkworthy had set up. But that bank was soon sold to the Bank of New South Wales, which just left the two banks, the Union Bank of Australia and the Bank of New South Wales. And in 1861 the Bank of New Zealand was set up, and so let's have a look at the establishment of the Bank of New Zealand here. Now that the capital of New Zealand was in Auckland, the Maori War broke out in 1860 in Taranaki as a consequence of the government taking possession of land which the Maoris contended they had not sold to the Crown. The government's legal adviser, Mr. Whittaker, being Attorney General, held that the Crown had acquired title, but Sir George Grey, who had hurriedly been sent back to New Zealand as governor upon the outbreak of war, made inquiry into the matter after his arrival in New Plymouth, and the documents and plans produced showed that the legal advice on which the government had acted was definitely bad, and the Maoris were right, and so the governor handed the original land in dispute back to the Maoris, even though soldiers confiscated more land in Taranaki after that period. And meanwhile Mr. Frederick Whittaker, who was at the heart of the controversy to do with the Maori Wars, in 1861 formed the partnership with Mr. Thomas Russell, who was a young man of 30 years at the time, of humble beginnings, but who had extensive networks throughout the Auckland community. And Mr. Russell promised Mr. Whittaker, his senior partner, £5,000 per year as a salary, and that's because their firm was involved in conveyancing and money lending there in the Auckland area. And also in 1861, Thomas Russell entered colonial politics, and in 1863, under the Alfred Domet administration, he became the Minister of Defence. And also in 1861, Thomas Russell formed a partnership with Falconer Larkworthy, who had been the manager of the Oriental Bank, to form the Bank of New Zealand, the B&Z. And this all goes back to the Maori Wars in New Zealand, and in 1869 Julius Vogel became the colonial treasurer, and in 1873 he became the Premier of New Zealand, and in 1874 Julius Vogel and Thomas Russell travelled together all the way back to London to raise another £4 million, and £2 million of those pounds was placed as a deposit with the B&Z, which then allowed that bank to lend out 3 times more than that under fractional reserve banking, and the other £2 million was the beginning of public works expenditure here in New Zealand. And so we know that Julius Vogel then began selling this confiscated land from the Maoris to people like Thomas Russell. And Thomas Russell went out and bought 80,000 acres there at the Piako block, and then to the south he bought 250,000 acres of the Patateri block, and to the east he bought 150,000 acres in the Thames Valley block. And so this was the beginning of the sale of the confiscated land to this private group of bankers and friends of bankers. And so this is what Sir George Grey had to say about it when he was in Parliament. And so that's all we've got time for in this episode of the financial history of New Zealand. And now that we've got COVID-19, our government debt has grown exponentially to the bankers.